Imagine a world where the human body is considered sinful to draw, where art exists only to serve God, where perspective is unknown, where the natural world is ignored in favor of religious symbolism. Imagine a world where human potential seems limited, where curiosity is discouraged, where the old ways have always been the only ways. This was Europe in the 14th century. And then, something extraordinary happened. In a small corner of Italy, in the city of Florence, a few individuals began to look at the world differently. They looked at ancient Roman ruins and asked, "What can we learn from this?" They looked at the human body and asked, "How does it actually work?" They looked at light and shadow and asked, "How can we capture this on canvas?" These were radical questions for their time. These questions would reshape civilization. What we call the Renaissance, the rebirth, was one of history's greatest transformations. It was not simply an artistic movement, though it produced some of the world's greatest art. It was not simply an intellectual shift, though it fundamentally changed how humans understood knowledge. It was a transformation of the human spirit itself. It was the moment when medieval Europe began to give way to the modern world. It was the moment when the individual human being began to be seen as worthy of study, when nature began to be worthy of imitation, when human potential began to seem limitless. The Renaissance took the inheritance of the ancient world, texts, sculptures, ideas, and transformed it into something new. It took the religious devotion of the medieval period and combined it with an explosion of secular curiosity. It took the limitations of the medieval worldview and shattered them, opening possibilities that had seemed impossible. How did a few artists and thinkers in Florence transform the entire continent? What made this particular moment in history so explosive with creative energy? How did the rediscovery of ancient knowledge combine with medieval Christianity to create something entirely new? And what does the Renaissance tell us about human potential, about the power of ideas, about what becomes possible when people dare to imagine the world differently? Before we begin, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps others discover these explorations of history. And let us know in the comments which historical figures or periods you'd like us to explore next. So settle in, dim the lights, and prepare to journey through one of history's most transformative periods. We will trace the emergence of a new way of seeing, a new way of creating, a new way of being human. We will meet the artists who changed forever how humans depict themselves and their world. We will explore the ideas that changed how humans understand knowledge, beauty, and possibility. We will discover how a rebirth of the ancient world created the modern world. This is the bedtime biography of the Renaissance, the period that proved humanity could be reborn, that art could capture truth, that the human spirit could transcend the limitations it had accepted for centuries. Section 1. The Awakening from Medieval to Modern. To understand the extraordinary transformation that the Renaissance represented, we must first understand the world it emerged from. The 14th century in Europe was a world of profound limitations. Not limitations of resources or knowledge alone, but limitations of imagination, of possibility, of how humans understood their own potential. The medieval worldview divided existence into two realms, the spiritual and the temporal. The spiritual realm, heaven, God, the divine, was the only realm that truly mattered. The temporal realm, the earthly world, the body, the physical universe, was essentially a testing ground. a place of trial before the true reality of the spiritual realm. Art existed to serve the spiritual realm. The purpose of painting was not to capture the beauty of the natural world or the particularity of human individuals. The purpose of painting was to inspire devotion, to remind viewers of spiritual truth, to point toward heaven. In a medieval painting, human figures were not depicted realistically. They were depicted according to spiritual importance. If a saint was more important spiritually, the saint would be depicted larger, even if the figure was supposed to be far away. If a human was less important spiritually, the human would be depicted smaller, even if the figure was supposed to be close. Perspective, the system that allows us to depict three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface in a way that matches how humans actually see, did not exist. Space in medieval paintings was compressed, flattened. Depth was suggested through overlapping and through gold leaf that created a sense of spiritual transcendence rather than physical space. The human body was considered a source of shame. The classical tradition of depicting the nude human form, which had flourished in ancient Greece and Rome, was rejected as sinful, as encouraging lust and carnal thoughts. Clothing was heavy and concealing. The body, when depicted in medieval art, was typically shown as suffering, as martyred, as something to be transcended rather than celebrated. The study of the natural world was not considered important. Nature was God's creation, certainly, but the details of nature, how plants grew, how animals moved, how light worked, were not seen as worthy subjects for artistic or intellectual attention. A flower in a medieval painting was not meant to look like an actual flower. It was a symbol, a representation of the spiritual concept of flowering, of growth, of eternity. When animals appeared in medieval art, they were often distorted or impossible because they represented something spiritual rather than something observed. Knowledge was understood as fixed and complete. The ancients had known truth. The church had preserved and interpreted that truth. There was nothing fundamentally new to discover. The purpose of learning was not to seek new knowledge, but to understand and absorb the knowledge that had already been revealed. Curiosity about the physical world was sometimes seen as a form of vanity or of sinful pride. Humans should focus on their spiritual salvation, not on satisfying their curiosity about how the world worked. The political system of feudalism fragmented Europe into countless small territories, each ruled by a local lord. Communication between distant regions was difficult and dangerous. Knowledge did not flow easily across the continent. Trade was limited. Cities were small and largely confined within protective walls. The sense of being part of a larger human community, of shared culture and possibility, was weak compared to a sense of belonging to a local lord, a local church, a local community. Yet, the very completeness and rigidity of this worldview contained the seeds of its own transformation. Because medieval thought claimed to have complete truth, any evidence that contradicted that truth, any discovery that could not be accommodated within the medieval framework, became revolutionary, as explorers brought back reports of lands and peoples not mentioned in the Bible or the classical texts, as scholars began to look more carefully at ancient texts and found contradictions, as artists began to experiment with new techniques and found that they could create beauty in ways that seemed to violate medieval principles, the certainty began to crack. The 14th century also brought suffering that medieval theology could not fully explain. The Black Death, bubonic plague killed perhaps a third of Europe's population. People prayed, performed penance, and the plague continued. This catastrophe created space for new thinking. If the old ways were not working, perhaps new ways should be tried. If God had allowed such suffering, perhaps humans needed to focus more on understanding the physical world they actually inhabited, rather than on understanding spiritual realms they could not see. In the late 13th and early 14th centuries, there emerged an artist whose work would mark the beginning of the Renaissance, even though the Renaissance itself was still more than a century away. His name was Giotto di Bondone, and he is considered the father of Western painting. What Giotto did that was revolutionary seems simple to modern eyes. He painted things that looked like things. He painted people who looked like people. He painted space that looked like space. Giotto was born around 1267 in a small town near Florence. He became an apprentice to Cimabue, a respected painter of the medieval tradition. But somewhere in his development, Giotto began to see the world differently. He began to observe how light actually fell on human faces. He began to study the proportions of the human body. He began to think about how to suggest three-dimensional space on a flat surface. The story is told that Giotto was sketching a sheep for his master Cimabue, and Cimabue was so impressed by the realistic quality of the drawing that he realized he was in the presence of a genius who had surpassed him. Whether the story is true or not, it captures something important. Giotto possessed an unusual commitment to rendering things as they actually appeared, rather than as tradition dictated they should be rendered. Giotto's breakthrough came through his commissions for religious buildings, churches, and chapels that needed to be decorated with frescoes. The most famous of these commissions was for the Arena Chapel in Padua, where Giotto painted a series of scenes from the life of Mary and the life of Christ. In these paintings, Giotto did something that had not been done in medieval art. He created convincing spatial depth. The figures in his paintings stood in real space, rather than being arranged on a flat gold background. Light and shadow modeled the forms of the bodies. The faces of the figures expressed emotion and individuality. What is remarkable is that Giotto created all of this without the full understanding of linear perspective that would come later. He did not have the mathematical system that would allow painters to create perfect perspective. Yet, through careful observation and intuitive understanding, he created paintings in which space felt real, in which figures felt solid and present. Giotto's innovation was revolutionary, but it was also subtle enough that it could be accommodated within the medieval framework. The scenes he painted were still religious. They still served the purpose of inspiring devotion. The innovation was in how convincingly he painted the sacred stories, not in changing what stories were considered worth painting. Yet the innovation of realism carried within it implications that would eventually transform art entirely. By making figures look more like actual humans, Giotto was implying that the human form was worth studying carefully. By painting space that looked like real space, he was implying that the physical world was worth understanding and depicting accurately. By showing emotion on the faces of the figures, he was implying that human feelings and experiences were worth portraying. All of these implications would eventually blossom into the Renaissance. Giotto lived into his 70s, long enough to see his work respected and influential. Artists began to study his paintings and to adopt his methods. The style did not spread uniformly across Europe. Medieval conventions persisted in many places for centuries. But in Italy, particularly in Florence, Giotto's innovations took root. Each generation of artists built on his work, pushing further toward realism, toward the study of the human form, toward the creation of convincing pictorial space. Giotto's paintings also had another significance. They demonstrated that art could be an individual expression of genius. Before Giotto, artists were respected craftspeople, but they were largely anonymous. Their work was valued as the faithful execution of conventional forms. Giotto's paintings were so recognizable, so distinctive, so clearly the product of one man's individual vision, that he became famous. Artists began to be understood not as craftspeople executing conventional forms, but as creative individuals expressing individual vision. This shift from anonymous craftsperson to named genius would become central to the Renaissance understanding of the artist. While Giotto was painting in Italy, something equally important was happening in the realm of ideas and texts. Scholars, particularly in Italy, began to recover and study the texts of ancient Rome and Greece. These texts had not disappeared entirely during the medieval period. Many had been preserved in monastic libraries, but they had been read selectively, interpreted through a medieval Christian lens, and not studied systematically as a complete body of knowledge. Beginning in the 14th century, scholars began to search for ancient texts with a new intensity. They traveled to monasteries across Europe, looking for forgotten manuscripts. They traveled to the Byzantine Empire, where Greek texts had been preserved more completely than in the West. They studied these texts with new methods, comparing different copies to try to determine what the author had originally written, rather than accepting medieval interpretations or corrupted versions. The recovery of these texts had profound implications. Ancient authors wrote about the physical world. They wrote about the human body. They wrote about beauty in ways that did not depend on Christian theology. They wrote about how to depict the human form accurately. They wrote about mathematics and geometry and perspective. They wrote about moral philosophy that was not explicitly Christian. The recovery of these texts opened possibilities that had seemed closed. One of the most significant figures in this recovery was Petrarch, who lived from 1304 to 1374. Petrarch was not primarily a visual artist, but a poet and scholar. Yet his work exemplified the spirit of the emerging Renaissance. Petrarch deliberately sought out manuscripts of ancient authors. He wrote letters to ancient authors, addressing them as if they were his contemporaries, asking them questions about life and virtue. He studied the classical past not as a quaint historical period, but as a living conversation with brilliant minds. Petrarch developed a method of reading that would become central to Renaissance scholarship. Close, critical reading of texts, comparing different versions, trying to understand the author's original meaning rather than accepting medieval interpretations. This method would eventually become the basis for modern scholarship. Petrarch was not a scientist or a visual artist, but his rigorous approach to understanding texts would influence how painters approached understanding the physical world through careful observation, comparison, and the pursuit of truth. The recovery of ancient texts also included the recovery of ancient artworks. As scholars traveled and explored, they encountered ruins of ancient buildings. They found sculptures and fragments of sculptures. They studied these works with the same intensity that they studied texts. Ancient sculptures showed the human body rendered with anatomical accuracy and beauty. Ancient buildings demonstrated principles of proportion and harmony. These physical remains of the ancient world provided models for understanding how the ancients had worked. The recovery of the classical past created a historical consciousness that had not existed in the medieval period. Scholars realized that there had been a great civilization, that it had been lost, and that it could be recovered and learned from. This created a kind of energy, a sense that the present could be transformed by learning from a superior past. Medieval scholars had believed that the present was a decline from a golden age in the distant past, when the truth had been revealed. Renaissance scholars believed that the past held wisdom that could transform the present, and that by recovering and studying that wisdom, they could create something new. By the early 15th century, the conditions were in place for the Renaissance to flourish, and the place where it did so most dramatically was Florence. Florence was a wealthy city-state, prosperous through banking and trade. It was governed by wealthy merchant families, particularly the Medici family, who understood that patronage of artists and scholars brought prestige and beauty to the city. The Medici and other wealthy families competed with each other to commission the greatest artists, to own the finest manuscripts, to attract the most brilliant minds. Florence was also a city with a particular tradition of civic pride. Unlike much of Italy, which was ruled by hereditary nobles and kings, Florence was a republic, governed by its merchants. This created a sense that the city belonged to its citizens, that its beauty reflected their character and accomplishment. This civic pride motivated investment in art and architecture that would represent the city's greatness. In Florence, the recovery of classical texts was pursued with particular intensity. Cosimo de' Medici founded a library and invited scholars to come to Florence to study and to teach. These scholars, who came from across Italy and from beyond, brought with them knowledge of Greek and Latin, understanding of ancient philosophy, and a commitment to recovering the wisdom of the ancients. They established schools where young men could learn classical languages and philosophy. They created an intellectual environment unlike any that existed elsewhere in Europe. The presence of both classical texts and classical artworks, fragments of sculptures, descriptions of ancient paintings in classical texts, the ability to study ruins, created a kind of conversation with the ancient world. Artists and scholars could read descriptions of how ancient painters worked, could study sculptures that demonstrated classical understanding of the human form, and could try to apply these classical principles to their own work. Florence also benefited from demographic factors. The plague had killed population, but by the 15th century, Europe was recovering. Population was growing again. Young people were being born into a world that had already begun to change. For these young people, the innovations that had seemed radical to their parents had become normal. They could build on these innovations, push further, achieve more than the previous generation. The period from 1400 to 1450 saw an explosion of artistic innovation centered in Florence. Filippo Brunelleschi, an architect and engineer, made a discovery that would transform painting: linear perspective. By studying optics and geometry, Brunelleschi figured out the mathematical system that would allow painters to depict three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface in a way that matched how humans actually see. He demonstrated his discovery by painting a wooden panel showing the Florentine baptistry, covered it with a mirror, and had people look at the reflection. The image was so convincing that many believed they were looking at the actual building. Brunelleschi's discovery of perspective was revolutionary. Suddenly, painters had a tool that allowed them to create perfect spatial illusion. The mathematical principles underlying perspective were based on geometry, on ratio, on proportion, on things that the ancients had understood. By recovering classical knowledge, by applying mathematical thinking to the problem of representation, Brunelleschi had created a system that would allow painters to achieve a level of realism that had not been possible before. Once perspective was understood, it spread rapidly. Young artists learned the system. They practiced drawing using perspective grids. They incorporated perspective into their paintings. The ability to create convincing spatial depth became one of the defining characteristics of Renaissance art. And with the ability to create perfect spatial depth came the ability to paint anything: landscapes, still life, complex scenes with multiple figures arranged in convincing space. As perspective allowed artists to create convincing space, another development was transforming how the human form was depicted. Artists began to study human anatomy with a new intensity. This study had practical motivations. If you wanted to draw a convincing human figure, you needed to understand how the human body was constructed, how bones and muscles worked together, how light fell on different parts of the body. This practical motivation led artists to engage in a kind of scientific investigation. They attended autopsies. They dissected cadavers. They drew what they saw, trying to understand the underlying structure of the human form. This was not simply the amateur investigation of curious craftspeople. This was serious anatomical study, pursued with the same intensity that physicians used. The artist and polymath Leonardo da Vinci exemplified this approach. Leonardo conducted over 30 human dissections during his lifetime. He made detailed anatomical drawings in his notebooks, far more accurate and detailed than any that had been made before. His drawings of muscles, of the circulation system, of organs, were based on direct observation and understanding. Leonardo believed that in order to paint the human figure convincingly, he needed to understand the human body completely. The underlying skeleton, the muscles, the organs, the circulation of blood. This approach to understanding the human body through direct observation was a radical departure from medieval practice. Medieval scholars had read the anatomical texts of ancient physicians like Galen and had accepted those texts as authoritative. When reality contradicted the texts, medieval scholars assumed they were misunderstanding reality, not that the texts were wrong. Renaissance artists and physicians, by contrast, trusted direct observation over ancient authority. If their dissections showed something different from what Galen had written, they concluded that Galen had been mistaken and that their own observations were more trustworthy. This shift from accepting authority to trusting observation would eventually transform not just art, but all of science. But it began with artists studying human anatomy to improve their paintings. As artists studied the human form, they began to celebrate it. They began to paint the human body not as something shameful that should be concealed, but as something beautiful, worthy of careful study and depiction. The recovery of classical sculptures, particularly nude male figures, provided models for this celebration of the human form. The classical ideal of the human body, as expressed in Greek and Roman sculpture, was an ideal of beauty, strength, and harmony. Renaissance artists studied these sculptures, learned from them, and created new works based on classical principles. The study of the human figure also led to a new understanding of human individuality. Medieval art had depicted types: the saint, the sinner, the wise man, the fool. Renaissance art increasingly depicted individuals, this particular person with these particular features, this particular expression. Portraits became an important genre, as wealthy patrons wanted to be depicted accurately and beautifully. The act of painting a portrait required careful observation and the development of technique to capture individual features and character. As the 15th century progressed, the subjects of art began to expand dramatically. No longer was art limited to religious subjects. Artists began to paint classical mythology. They painted historical scenes. They painted landscapes. They painted still life. They painted portraits. The range of subject matter expanded exponentially. This expansion of subjects was enabled by the technical innovations, perspective, accurate rendering of the human form. But it also reflected a changing worldview. As artists began to see the natural world as worth studying and depicting, landscapes began to appear in paintings. These were not landscapes for their own sake, but landscapes as settings for human action. Yet the careful depiction of landscapes meant that nature was being observed and understood. Artists began to study how light worked. They noticed how light changed the appearance of objects. They studied how light fell on different surfaces. They experimented with different techniques for rendering light. The study of light became central to painting, because light was what made things visible, what made them beautiful. Artists also began to study color with new sophistication. They experimented with different pigments. They learned how colors interacted with each other. They developed techniques for mixing colors to achieve the effects they wanted. Color became not simply a way to identify objects. The sky is blue, the grass is green, but a tool for creating mood, for guiding the viewer's eye, for expressing the painter's individual vision. The expansion of artistic subjects also meant that art was no longer limited to serving religion. Artists could paint whatever they found beautiful or interesting. This liberation from the requirement that art serve a religious purpose was revolutionary. It meant that artists could follow their curiosity, could paint what they observed, could create beauty for its own sake. This shift from art serving an external purpose to art expressing individual vision and curiosity was fundamental to the development of art as we understand it. The study of nature also led to a kind of wonder about the world. As artists studied the natural world, they became aware of its complexity and beauty. They became aware that there was more to understand, more to discover, more to depict than medieval thinkers had imagined. This sense of wonder at the natural world, combined with the confidence that observation and study could unlock its secrets, would drive the scientific revolution that followed the Renaissance. Section 2. The Triumph of Genius, the High Renaissance. In the late 15th century, there emerged an artist who would come to be seen as the greatest artist who ever lived: Michelangelo Buonarroti. Michelangelo was not the most technically perfect painter, nor the most innovative in developing new techniques, but he possessed a combination of skills, a depth of vision, and an ability to execute his vision that seemed almost superhuman to his contemporaries. Michelangelo was born in 1475 in a small town in Tuscany. His father was a businessman, not an artist, and initially opposed Michelangelo's desire to become an artist. But Michelangelo was determined. He became an apprentice to a respected painter and then attracted the attention of Lorenzo de' Medici, the ruler of Florence. Lorenzo brought the young artist into his household and provided him with opportunity to develop his talents. From the beginning, Michelangelo was focused on the human form. He sculpted when sculpture was considered a lesser art than painting. He dissected cadavers to understand human anatomy. He drew constantly, filling notebooks with studies of the human body from every angle. This obsessive study of the human form would drive everything he created. Michelangelo's first major work was a sculpture of David, created when he was in his 20s. The David is a life-size marble sculpture depicting the biblical hero David in the moment before his battle with Goliath. What is extraordinary about the sculpture is its combination of ideal beauty and psychological depth. The body is depicted with perfect anatomical accuracy, based on Michelangelo's careful study of the human form. Yet the figure is not simply a beautiful nude man. The expression on the face shows concentration and determination. The slight tension in the body suggests readiness for action. This is not a timeless ideal, but a particular moment, a particular person about to do something difficult. The David became a symbol of Renaissance achievement. When it was completed, it was placed in Florence's main square, where it could be seen by everyone. The sculpture proclaimed that humans could create beauty equal to nature. It proclaimed that the human form was worthy of the most careful study and most perfect execution. It proclaimed that art could express both ideal beauty and profound human feeling. After the David, Michelangelo received a commission that would occupy him for much of his life: to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Rome. The chapel was the Pope's private chapel, and the ceiling had originally been painted with a simple design. The new Pope, Julius II, decided that the ceiling should be completely repainted with a more ambitious scheme. He asked Michelangelo to create the new ceiling. Michelangelo was not enthusiastic about the commission. He considered himself primarily a sculptor, not a painter. He was concerned about his ability to work in fresco, a technique in which pigments are applied to wet plaster and become an integral part of the plaster surface. Once the plaster dries, the painting cannot be changed or corrected. It is a technique that allows no mistakes. Yet, Michelangelo accepted the commission. For 4 years, he lay on his back on a scaffold, stretched high above the chapel floor, painting the vast ceiling. He created a composition depicting scenes from the book of Genesis, from the creation of the world through the flood. The composition is organized with remarkable sophistication. At the center are scenes of creation. Around these central scenes are representations of the sibyls and prophets who, according to medieval theology, had foreseen the coming of Christ. At the corners are scenes of human salvation through figures from the Old Testament. What makes the Sistine ceiling transcendent is Michelangelo's ability to depict human emotion and the human form with an unprecedented depth. The figures are muscular, clearly based on Michelangelo's study of human anatomy. Yet the figures are also expressions of emotion and meaning. The moment of creation, where God reaches toward Adam and gives him life, is depicted not as a religious symbol, but as a profound human moment. The moment when an inert body becomes a living being, when consciousness comes into the world. Michelangelo's work on the Sistine ceiling demonstrated something that had not been fully clear before: that the human form, studied with perfect accuracy, was sufficient to express the deepest human meanings. There was no need for gold leaf, for halos, for symbolic details. The human figure itself, rendered with perfect understanding of anatomy and with sensitivity to human emotion, could express the sacred, the profound, the meaningful. Leonardo da Vinci was born in 1452 in Vinci, a small town near Florence. He was the illegitimate son of a notary and a peasant woman. His illegitimacy meant that he could not attend university or follow the traditional path to education. Instead, he became an apprentice to a respected Florentine painter named Verrocchio. This apprenticeship would prove to be more valuable than a university education. Working in Verrocchio's studio, Leonardo learned painting but also sculpture, engineering, and the practical sciences that the studio needed for creating art. Leonardo's notebooks, thousands of pages that have survived to the present day, reveal a mind of extraordinary range. Leonardo drew weapons and machines. He drew plans for flying machines and submarines, devices that would not be invented for centuries. He drew anatomical studies based on dissections. He drew plants and flowers and animals. He studied the flow of water, the way hair fell, the way light reflected off surfaces. He was interested in everything. This breadth of interest was not scattered or unfocused. Leonardo believed that all knowledge was connected, that understanding one thing helped you understand everything else. He believed that art and science were not separate realms, but expressions of the same fundamental human impulse to understand the world. When he studied anatomy to improve his paintings, he was also contributing to medical knowledge. When he observed how water flowed, he was both understanding the physical world and learning how to depict the effects of water in paintings. Leonardo created relatively few paintings compared to other artists of his time, but nearly every painting he created is a masterpiece. The Last Supper, painted on the wall of a monastery in Milan, is one of the most famous paintings in the world. In this painting, Leonardo depicts the moment when Jesus tells his disciples that one of them will betray him. Rather than depicting the disciples in a state of calm acceptance, as medieval tradition would have suggested, Leonardo shows them in a state of shock and emotional turmoil. Each disciple has a distinct reaction. Some are denying that they would betray Jesus. Some are questioning whether they themselves might be the betrayer. The painting captures a moment of profound human emotion and moral crisis. The Last Supper is remarkable for its psychological depth, but also for its mathematical sophistication. Leonardo used perspective to organize the composition. The vanishing point of the perspective system is located behind the head of Jesus, drawing the viewer's attention to Jesus and organizing the entire composition around him. The disciples are arranged in groups of 3, creating a rhythmic organization that is both visually harmonious and psychologically expressive of the different emotional states of the disciples. Leonardo's most famous painting is probably the Mona Lisa, a portrait of a woman of unknown identity. The painting is small, and the woman depicted is not particularly beautiful or remarkable in appearance. Yet, the painting has fascinated people for centuries. The fascination comes largely from the expression on the woman's face, an expression that seems to combine contentment and subtle sadness, warmth and distance. The expression seems to shift depending on the angle from which the painting is viewed and the emotional state of the viewer. It is an expression that suggests profound emotional complexity in a way that no painting before had done. Leonardo achieved this effect through a technique called sfumato, which means smoky in Italian. Instead of using hard lines to define forms, Leonardo used soft transitions between tones. There are no sharp shadows. The features fade into each other. This technique created an effect of atmosphere and softness that allowed for subtle gradations of emotion and expression. Leonardo's approach to painting was based on a profound understanding of how humans see. He understood that vision was not a mechanical process of light entering the eye and creating an image, but an active process in which the mind interprets what the eye sees. He understood that emotion was expressed through subtle shifts in facial expression, through the position of the body, through the interaction of figure and background. By understanding how vision worked, he could create paintings that worked on the viewer's mind in subtle and profound ways. While Michelangelo and Leonardo were creating masterpieces, another artist was emerging who would come to be seen as the embodiment of Renaissance perfection, Raffaello Sanzio, known as Raphael. Raphael was born in 1483 and died in 1520 at the age of 37. In his short life, he created an extraordinary body of work that was admired for its perfect balance, its harmonious composition, and its clear, direct beauty. Raphael was trained in Umbria, in central Italy, under the painter Perugino. He learned from Perugino the principles of clear, harmonious composition and the depiction of graceful figures. But Raphael was not content to simply repeat what he had learned. He went to Florence and studied the works of Leonardo and Michelangelo. He learned from them, but he developed his own distinctive style. What characterizes Raphael's work is a quality of perfect balance and harmony. Where Michelangelo created figures that were muscular and almost overly powerful, Raphael created figures that were graceful and perfectly proportioned. Where Leonardo created psychological depth and subtle emotion, Raphael created clear, direct beauty. Raphael's paintings seem to represent an ideal world, a world in which everything is in perfect harmony, in which human relationships are expressed with perfect clarity and grace. Raphael's most famous painting is probably the School of Athens, a fresco painted in the Vatican. The painting depicts the ancient Greek philosophers Plato and Aristotle in the center, surrounded by other philosophers and scientists of the ancient world. The painting is remarkable for its composition. The figures are arranged in groups, but the composition as a whole creates a sense of perfect balance and harmony. The perspective system was used to draw the viewer's eye toward the central figures of Plato and Aristotle. The gestures of the figures are clearly expressive, pointing, discussing, demonstrating ideas. What makes the School of Athens significant is not only its aesthetic beauty, but also its meaning. By depicting ancient philosophers, by giving them prominence and beauty, Raphael was proclaiming that secular learning was worthy of respect. This was still controversial in the early 16th century. The Church was still the dominant institution, still the primary patron of art. Yet here in the Vatican itself, in a fresco painted for the Pope, ancient pagan philosophers were being depicted with the same dignity and beauty that would have been given to saints. Raphael also created paintings of the Virgin Mary and Christ Child. These paintings combined classical beauty with Christian devotion. The Virgin is depicted with perfect grace, the Child is depicted with innocent charm, and the paintings express Christian feeling through the language of classical beauty. By combining the Christian tradition with classical form, Raphael demonstrated that the Renaissance was not simply a recovery of paganism, but a synthesis of classical learning with Christian tradition. By the late 15th century, the innovations that had emerged in Italy began to spread to other parts of Europe. Northern Europe, the Low Countries, Germany, France, had developed its own artistic traditions, independent of Italian developments. Yet, by the early 16th century, Northern artists began to encounter Italian ideas and techniques. Some traveled to Italy to study. Some saw works by Italian artists. Gradually, the innovations of perspective, realistic depiction of the human form, classical learning began to influence Northern art. The spread of printing also played a crucial role in the dissemination of Renaissance ideas. Johann Gutenberg invented the printing press in Germany around 1450. Suddenly, books could be produced rapidly and inexpensively. The text that Renaissance scholars had been recovering, classical manuscripts, new works by contemporary writers, could be printed and distributed throughout Europe. Students in Germany or France could now read the same texts that were being studied in Italy. The intellectual revolution of the Renaissance was no longer confined to Italy. The Spanish conquest of the Americas in 1492 also had implications for the Renaissance. Columbus and subsequent explorers brought back reports of unknown lands and peoples. This contradicted the medieval assumption that the world was known and mapped. There were unknown places, unknown peoples, unknown possibilities. This geographical expansion of the world reinforced the Renaissance sense that there were always new things to discover and understand. The Protestant Reformation, beginning with Martin Luther in 1517, had complicated implications for the Renaissance. Luther challenged church authority and called for a return to the Bible and early Christian texts. This seemed like a reaction against Renaissance learning. Yet, the methods used by Luther and other reformers were Renaissance methods: careful reading of texts, comparison of different versions, the pursuit of original meaning. The Reformation was in some ways an extension of Renaissance textual scholarship into theology. The spread of Renaissance ideas was not uniform. In some places, classical learning and realistic depiction were quickly adopted. In other places, medieval traditions persisted for longer. But by 1550, the visual culture of Europe had been transformed. Perspective was now standard in painting. The human form was depicted with accuracy and often with beauty. Secular subjects were accepted alongside religious subjects. The individual artist was recognized as a creative genius. The intellectual culture of Europe was being transformed by the recovery of classical texts and the methods of critical scholarship developed by Renaissance scholars. The Renaissance transformed not just art and learning, but the way humans understood themselves and their potential. Before the Renaissance, the medieval worldview saw human life as fundamentally limited. Humans were born into a station in life and remained there. Humans' abilities were limited by their birth, their gender, their circumstances. The great achievements of the past had been accomplished by the ancients or by saints granted special grace by God. Ordinary humans could not expect to accomplish extraordinary things. The Renaissance demonstrated that this was not necessarily true. Giotto, the son of a peasant, had become one of the greatest artists who ever lived. Michelangelo, the son of a minor nobleman who had no wealth or particular advantage, had created the greatest sculptures and paintings the world had seen. Leonardo, illegitimate and without university education, had made contributions to art and knowledge that rivaled the greatest achievements of any human. These examples demonstrated that human potential was not fixed by birth. Talent, dedication, and opportunity could allow ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. This belief in human potential led to a new kind of education. Young men were educated not simply to fulfill the station into which they were born, but to develop their talents and abilities. The concept of the Renaissance man, a person educated in multiple fields, skilled in both arts and sciences, able to contribute to multiple domains of knowledge, became an ideal. This ideal of the educated, multi-talented human became central to Western education and continues to influence education to the present day. The Renaissance also transformed the way humans understood the relationship between the mind and the body. Medieval Christianity had seen the body as a source of shame and temptation, something to be transcended or overcome. The Renaissance, influenced by classical ideals, saw the body as beautiful and worthy of study and depiction. This did not necessarily mean that medieval Christian morality was abandoned, but it meant that the body was no longer seen as purely evil or tempting. The body could be beautiful. The body could express the human spirit. The body was integral to human identity. This transformation in the understanding of the body contributed to a transformation in the understanding of the self. In the medieval period, the individual human was not of much importance. What mattered was one's role in society, one's relationship to God, one's membership in a collective. In the Renaissance, the individual began to be understood as important. Individual talent, individual vision, individual character began to matter. The portrait became a major art form because individuals wanted to be depicted and remembered. Biography and autobiography became important literary forms because the lives of individual people were seen as worth recording. This emphasis on individuality is sometimes seen as the birth of modern individualism. Certainly, the Renaissance emphasized individual talent and individual achievement in ways that the medieval period had not. Yet the Renaissance also believed in harmony, in balance, in ideals that transcended the individual. The human was understood as part of a larger order, but as a part that could be beautiful and meaningful in itself. Section 3. The meaning of transformation. Renaissance legacies and eternal questions. One of the most important legacies of the Renaissance was the development of a method of investigation based on careful observation and the testing of ideas against reality. This method emerged from the work of artists studying anatomy, studying light, studying perspective. It also emerged from the work of scholars carefully reading ancient texts and comparing them to reality. When reality contradicted the texts, Renaissance thinkers trusted reality. This method would become the foundation of science. In the centuries following the Renaissance, scientists would use this method to investigate the physical world. They would observe nature carefully. They would form hypotheses about how nature worked. They would test these hypotheses through experiment and observation. This scientific method, which now seems obvious and natural, was not obvious to the medieval mind. It emerged from the Renaissance combination of practical investigation, classical learning, and trust in direct observation. Galileo, who lived from 1564 to 1642, exemplified this method. Galileo was trained in the Renaissance tradition. He was skilled in mathematics and geometry. He was interested in how things actually worked, not simply accepting ancient authorities. When he looked through a telescope at the sky, he saw things that contradicted what Aristotle and Ptolemy had written about the heavens. Rather than assuming he must be mistaken or that the telescope must be wrong, he concluded that Aristotle and Ptolemy had been mistaken. His observations of the moons of Jupiter, of mountains on the moon, of spots on the sun, provided evidence that the heavens were not as perfect and unchanging as medieval and ancient authorities had claimed. Galileo's approach, careful observation, mathematical analysis, willingness to contradict ancient authorities based on direct evidence, emerged directly from Renaissance methods. By the 17th century, this method had become dominant in the investigation of nature. Science would build on the foundation that the Renaissance had laid. The development of perspective in painting had implications that went far beyond painting. Perspective created a particular way of seeing and understanding space. It created a point of view from which the world could be observed and understood. This perspective was not God's eye view, not a view from outside the world, but a human point of view, the point of view of a particular observer in a particular location. The centrality of perspective in Renaissance thought influenced how humans understood themselves. If the world could be understood from a particular human point of view, then the human observer was central to understanding reality. Reality was not something that existed completely independent of the observer. Reality was something that the observer encountered and understood from a particular perspective. This contributed to the birth of modern consciousness, the sense that the human individual is central to experience, that personal perspective and personal understanding are important, that the world is understood through the mediation of individual consciousness. This is the consciousness of modern humans. We tend to take it for granted that we understand the world through our individual perspective, that our personal experience is important, that the subjective and objective are distinct but intertwined. This consciousness emerged, in part, from the Renaissance development of perspective. The Renaissance also contributed to the development of the individual human as a subject worthy of attention and representation. The portrait as an art form suggests that individual human faces and characters are worthy of careful study and depiction. Biography suggests that individual human lives are worth recording and understanding. The novel, which emerged as a literary form in the Renaissance and after, focuses on the internal experiences of individual characters. All of these forms of representation emerge from the Renaissance belief that the individual human is worthy of attention. Yet, this emphasis on individuality did not mean that all individuality was equally valued. The individuals who were portrayed in Renaissance art were typically wealthy, powerful, or talented. The individual whose face was worth depicting was typically someone of status. The individual whose life was worth recording in biography was typically someone of importance. The Renaissance emphasis on individuality coexisted with a hierarchical understanding of society in which some individuals were more worthy of attention than others. The Renaissance was not simply a period of technical innovation and artistic achievement. It was also a period when fundamental questions about art and knowledge were posed in new ways. What is the purpose of art? Is art meant to imitate nature or to express individual vision? Is art meant to represent universal ideals or individual particularity? Is truth in art achieved through accurate representation or through other means? These questions were posed by Renaissance artists and thinkers, and they remain important to the present day. The Renaissance answer to the question, "What is the purpose of art?" was complex. Art was meant to express the artist's individual vision and creativity. Art was also meant to reflect universal ideals of beauty and harmony. Art was meant to engage the viewer's intellect and emotion. Art was meant to make the viewer see the world differently, to make the viewer aware of beauty and meaning in the world. Art was not simply a tool for other purposes, religious instruction, political propaganda, decoration. Art had value in itself. Yet, at the same time, art was understood as a form of knowledge. By studying nature carefully and depicting it accurately, artists were contributing to knowledge of nature. By studying the human form and depicting it accurately, artists were contributing to knowledge of human anatomy and human nature. Art and science were not separate. Artists were engaged in a form of investigation of reality, and the knowledge they gained in creating art was valuable knowledge. This understanding of art as both individual expression and form of knowledge would have lasting consequences. It established the artist as someone whose work was valuable not because it served an external purpose, but because the artist had something true and important to communicate. This would eventually lead to the modern understanding of the artist as a kind of visionary or prophet, someone whose unique perspective gives them access to truths that others might miss. The Renaissance also established the idea of the artwork as a unique, irreplaceable creation. In the medieval period, art was often understood as the skilled execution of conventional forms. A painting of the Virgin and Child could be replicated. As long as the skilled execution was adequate, one painting was as good as another. The Renaissance changed this. The individual artist's unique way of seeing, of depicting, of expressing, became central to the value of the artwork. A painting by Leonardo was valuable not simply because it depicted a certain subject, but because it was painted by Leonardo, because it expressed Leonardo's unique vision. This created the basis for the modern art market, in which original works of art by recognized artists command enormous prices. It created the basis for museums, institutions devoted to preserving and displaying unique artworks created by great artists. It created the basis for art history as a discipline devoted to understanding the unique contributions of individual artists and how their work contributed to the development of art. 1400–1600. It is tempting to see the Renaissance as a complete break from the medieval period, a revolutionary transformation from darkness to light, from ignorance to knowledge, from faith to reason. But the reality was more complex. The Renaissance did not entirely reject the medieval period. In many ways, it preserved medieval elements while transforming them. Most Renaissance art remained religious art. Most Renaissance artists worked on commission from the church, or from wealthy patrons for religious purposes. The great paintings and sculptures that emerged from the Renaissance often depicted biblical stories or Christian saints. What changed was not that art was no longer religious, but how religious stories were depicted. They were depicted with psychological depth, with anatomically accurate human figures, with convincing spatial depth, with individual emotional expression. Medieval elements also persisted in Renaissance thought. Medieval cosmology, the belief that the Earth was at the center of the universe, that the heavens were composed of spheres, persisted even as Renaissance thinkers began to question it. Medieval theology, the belief that God had revealed truth through the Church, remained important. The Renaissance did not simply overturn medieval ideas. It complicated them, challenged them, forced them to coexist with new ideas. The medieval idea that there was a hierarchy of being, with God at the top, angels below, humans below them, animals below humans, and matter at the bottom, persisted into the Renaissance. Renaissance thinkers did not completely reject this hierarchy. Rather, they elevated humans within the hierarchy. Humans were not simply material beings, lower than angels. Humans had rational souls, had the capacity for knowledge and creation. Humans could participate in the divine through intellectual and artistic creation. This elevation of humans did not reject the medieval hierarchy, but rather repositioned humans within it. The persistence of medieval elements in the Renaissance reminds us that historical periods do not have sharp boundaries. The Renaissance did not begin on a particular date and end on another date. Different places experienced the Renaissance at different times. Some places held on to medieval ideas longer than others. Some aspects of medieval thought persisted longer than others. The Renaissance was a gradual process of transformation, not a sudden revolutionary break. Nearly 6 centuries have passed since the height of the Renaissance. Scientific revolutions have transformed our understanding of the universe. Technological revolutions have transformed how humans live. Yet the Renaissance remains central to how we understand ourselves and our world. Why is this? First, the Renaissance established the belief that humans can transcend their circumstances through talent, dedication, and opportunity. This belief has been central to Western culture for centuries. It has driven education, scientific investigation, artistic creation. Even though the reality often fails to live up to this ideal, not everyone has equal opportunity. Talent is not evenly distributed. Dedication is not always rewarded. The ideal persists that humans have potential that can be developed. Second, the Renaissance established that the human individual is worthy of respect and depiction. This has had profound implications. It contributed to the development of human rights, the belief that all individual humans have inherent worth and dignity. It contributed to the development of psychology and psychiatry, fields devoted to understanding individual human minds. It contributed to modern medicine, devoted to healing individual humans. None of this was inevitable. It emerged from a cultural belief, first articulated in the Renaissance, that individual humans are important. Third, the Renaissance established a method of investigation based on careful observation and the testing of ideas against reality. This method has transformed science and how we understand the natural world. It has driven technological development. It has fundamentally changed human power over nature and human ability to improve human life. Almost everything that modern medicine, modern agriculture, modern technology has accomplished is based on this method of investigation that emerged in part from Renaissance artists studying nature. Fourth, the Renaissance established that art is not primarily a tool for serving external purposes, but an expression of individual vision and creativity. This has made art central to human culture. Art is understood as something that allows humans to express what cannot be expressed in other ways. Art is understood as something that can change how humans see the world, can open new possibilities, can express truths that logical language cannot express. This understanding of art comes from the Renaissance. As we confront the challenges of the contemporary world, climate change, inequality, political division, threats to human freedom, we might ask what the Renaissance has to teach us. One lesson is that humans can transform the world through creativity, through dedication, through the pursuit of truth. Another lesson is that periods of great cultural achievement often emerge when different traditions come together. When the wisdom of the past is combined with the innovations of the present. Another lesson is that the individual human, with their particular perspective and vision, is important. The Renaissance demonstrates that human potential is not fixed, that transformation is possible, that the world we inherit can be transcended, that beauty can be created where there was none before. These lessons remain relevant nearly 6 centuries after the Renaissance began. As we lie in the darkness, thinking about the Renaissance, we might imagine what it felt like to be a young artist in Florence in the early 15th century. You have been trained in the medieval tradition. You have learned to paint according to medieval conventions. You have learned that art serves religious purposes, that art follows established rules and patterns. And then you encounter the work of Giotto, dead for decades but still revolutionary. You read the ancient texts that scholars have recovered. You study classical sculpture. You learn the mathematical principles of perspective. And suddenly, you realize that everything you had believed about art, about what was possible, was wrong. The human body is not sinful, but beautiful. The natural world is not insignificant, but worthy of study. Space can be depicted accurately. Human emotion can be expressed through art. Individual vision matters. This sense of liberation, of possibilities opening up, of the world becoming larger and more interesting than you had believed. This was the Renaissance. It was a period when humans realized that the limitations they had accepted were not necessary, that the world could be understood differently, that human potential was greater than tradition had suggested. Michelangelo, lying on his back on the scaffold in the Sistine Chapel, creating the image of the creation of Adam, was expressing something that had not been expressed before. He was saying that the human form, understood perfectly, was sufficient to express the sacred and the profound. Leonardo, dissecting cadavers and filling notebooks with observations, was saying that understanding the physical world through direct observation was valuable, even if it contradicted ancient authorities. Raphael, creating paintings of perfect beauty and harmony, was saying that human creation could achieve an ideal beauty. These artists were not simply creating beautiful objects. They were making a statement about human potential and human worth. They were saying that humans, through talent, dedication, and the pursuit of knowledge, could achieve something extraordinary. They were saying that the human spirit was not confined to a single realm, but could express itself through art, through science, through the careful observation and depiction of the world. The world since the Renaissance has changed dramatically. Science has revealed the vastness of the universe, the long history of life on Earth, the fundamental particles that make up matter. Technology has transformed how humans live. Democracy has expanded the rights and opportunities of ordinary people. Yet the fundamental insights of the Renaissance, that humans have potential, that individual humans matter, that beauty and truth can be pursued and achieved, that the world is more interesting and complex than we initially believe. These insights remain true. As you drift off to sleep, think of the young artists and thinkers of the Renaissance, pursuing their vision despite the weight of tradition, the limitations of their time, the resistance of those who believed that the old ways were sufficient. Think of their willingness to observe carefully, to question authority, to try new approaches. Think of their belief that human potential could be expanded, that the world could be understood more deeply, that beauty could be created. The Renaissance reminds us that another world is always possible, that the limitations we accept are not always necessary, that human potential is greater than we often believe, that the pursuit of beauty, truth, and knowledge is not a luxury, but something central to being human, that individuals matter, that our unique perspective and vision have value, that we can contribute to transforming the world, whether through creating beauty, pursuing knowledge, or expressing what cannot be expressed in other ways. This has been the bedtime biography of the Renaissance, the period when humans proved that they could be reborn, that art could capture truth, that the individual spirit could transcend the limitations of tradition and convention, a period when the ancient world was recovered and transformed into something new, a period when human potential seemed limitless and the future full of possibility. Thank you for spending this time with us exploring one of history's most transformative periods. Please like and subscribe for more explorations of the figures and events that shaped our world, and let us know in the comments what historical topics you'd like us to investigate next, or what aspects of the Renaissance inspire you most. Until next time, rest well, and know that the human potential that the Renaissance revealed in itself is also present in you. Your unique perspective matters. Your ability to learn and create matters. Your vision, pursued with dedication, can contribute to transforming the world.